Part 4 of the events discussion, week 11/27 to 12/01. I'm going to talk about 6 events: Xin Duan, neural circuit mapping, trace neural activity from input to the brain using the retinal system; Gene Fan, visualizing cell information and cell differences by capturing RNA information, so transcriptomics, similar to Xin Duan's work. Then I'm going away from neuroscience and visualization to Alex Levy, visualization extracting 3D models from 2D pictures, in particular protein identification. So this technology competes with AlphaFold. Then Storage X, Stefan Reichelstein, emeritus professor from Stanford. He's now working in Germany on a project where he's budgeting a city in Saudi Arabia, actually, that is supposed to be built and 100% renewable. And he was talking about how to budget 100% renewable for storage. Then next, Taran Driver from Slac. He was showing how atosecond pulses and technology can help visualize electrons. Lastly, Ciamac Moallemi, mechanism design. He works with Tim Rothgarden, A16Z. This is automated market makers for Defi. So how can Black Scholes inspired models help market making in decentralized finance? Or in other words, how can you make markets without a central authority? This is a Not Even Wrong podcast. It's December 4th, 2023. This is Crim Telco. For the day, the fund is down 3.5%. The market's down 0.5%. For the year, we're up 104.3. The market is up 19. We're outperforming by 85.3%. So let me start with Xin Duan. He is a neuroscientist at UCSF, and his presentation was about neural mapping. Now, this is really very interesting work. Think about it this way, okay? We want to understand how input signals in the eye, in this case, he's working with the retinal nervous system, so let's stick with that just for simplicity, but you could use this for other neural activities. So the light comes in, and then signals get transferred from the eye to the brain, and how can we map that? By having the ability to map something like that, of course, opens up massive opportunities to heal problems, to see where things go wrong, and just to study the neural system. This goes even back to Alex Sachs. I mean, how about understanding the layers and which layer acts how, and how different visual performances are affected by the circuitry in the neural system? So being able to visualize neural circuitry, in my opinion, is a massive endeavor, very interesting. The way they do it is they create a marker, then they use that marker to use the ability to isolate that marker throughout the neural system. So you can have a marker which is, let's say, some sort of protein, and then you can use optogenetics to make sure that when you shine a light on a particular part of the brain, that particular marker shines a certain light. So you can kind of see where things are going. Once you know that, you can create a map. You can sort of see, just think about it like a map, like a Google map, right? You have a map from input to output, and then you can use transcriptomic data to actually identify the cell types that are responsible for transmitting electric signals from one place to the other in the neural system. So there's 4 components in this paper. Again, create the marker, develop a technology to isolate the marker at any level, then create a map, and then finally use transcriptomic data to identify which cells are transmitting the signal to each other. So those are the 4 things that he's discussing in this paper. There's a lot more technology and a lot more subtle scientific work involved here. But I would say for my purposes, this is certainly enough, because I'm pretty intrigued by this work, I have to say, because it's close to Alex Sachs's work. It's close to digital neural nets. We want to understand how they work. We want to understand how the brain works. So those are very similar. Endeavors, and I think obviously we have different approaches. In particular, we have the advantage of digital neural nets being created by us, and hence we kind of have the luxury to maybe better monitor them. But nevertheless, this is pretty interesting. Next is Xin Duan from Johns Hopkins. Now, this is a really interesting personality. Before I go into her work, I have to say she's a very interesting person. I would say a very attractive person, and I don't mean this in some sexual way or anything like that, although she's a very attractive woman, but I just mean attractive, like she's interesting to look at. And she proclaims herself an artist. She has YouTube videos. I think she's making an effort to send a visual signal that she has a certain approach towards life, which is unique. So let's leave it at that. Very interesting person. Now, she's also using transcriptomic data. And the idea here is, think about it this way. Like you want to, let's say, take the mammalian brain and you want to understand which cells are where and why are they there. And in particular, you want to understand what happens in biological processes. This is very similar to the work previously mentioned where you map neural circuitry. What Xin Duan's doing is she's just mapping the brain. So she's not necessarily interested just in neural circuitry. She's a biostatistician, so she works with things like R, and she's analyzing data and trying to find out, let's say, how do certain genes get expressed in the brain, find locations where those genes are through the transcriptome, which is the RNA, which is related to the genes, and potentially help with disease fighting, because once you see where a certain gene is being expressed, and then you can maybe see that it's the same thing is not happening with a healthy cell, so you can maybe identify, okay, this is part of the problem here. Where are the genes? Why are they different? Statistical tools to analyze differences. She's explaining in one of her videos how, for example, you have to sort of normalize for natural occurrence of certain cells and the sort of variety of certain cells, and try to isolate. Let's say if somebody has a certain disease, let's say Alzheimer's, you want to have sort of a digital twin of a healthy brain, and then see the Alzheimer's brain. So and what is a healthy brain? What does that even mean? How do you translate that? So she's using technologies from natural language processing to explain that, and I think she's doing a very, very good job in doing that. Next is Alex Levy, PhD student here at Stanford. His work is as his professor, Wettstein, forgot the first name, Chris, I believe, or Alex Wettstein, says it's nerves without knowing where the camera is. So the problem is the following. You want to reconstruct 2D images into 3D. So what he's using as an example is visualizing proteins. The way proteins are visualized is through cryo-electron microscopy. And think of it like this way: the protein is being put in water, and then electron microscopes, electromagnetic radiation shines through this water with the molecules. Let's say you have some sort of methane, and you're trying to visualize the protein. Excuse me, you have a protein, not a molecule. You have a protein, and you're trying to visualize it. You're trying to see the structure, and as we know, structure is pretty important for proteins. Now, the way you do that is in electron microscopy is you will shine electromagnetic radiation through that water mixture, and then you will get a 2D representation of that picture. How can you go from that 2D to 3D? There's two steps involved. One is you use physics-based modeling to sort of guess the poses, so the orientation of the protein parts, and then you use Nerfs to reconstruct a 3D picture. This is roughly the idea. I'm not going too deep into details in terms of how it works. This is pretty intense math, computational photography, and definitely some machine learning approaches, particularly the Nerf side of things. So you're trying to sort of estimate where things might be heading based on learnings. So in that sense, it's similar to AlphaFold, but it's actually a very different technology because this is computational photography. It's not reinforcement learning. Next is a Storage X presentation. This time it was Stefan Reichelstein, a professor emeritus from Stanford. He's now at the University of Mannheim. Now, he is working on a project where he's budgeting for a new city that is supposed to be built in Saudi Arabia. And the idea is to have it fully renewable with storage. And my thought was, why do you need storage? If you can build a city from scratch, why don't you just build stranded energy utilization production resources such as Bitcoin mining, aluminum, ammonia, those sort of things, where you just produce, so you have, let's say, let's just assume you need 100 units of electricity for all the citizens, let's say at a maximum rate. Like, so you build 150 units of electricity, so you have always 50% more than you actually need. And then the surplus can be used by those production technologies. And then whenever, let's say you only use 80, you use 70. So you have this flexible curve, almost like a, like the market making mechanism in automated market mix. I'm going to get through this a bit later, but think of it like a curve with X and Y, and X is the demand of residents, and Y is the demand of production, let's say factories, and that curve is smooth, and whenever you need more of this, you have less of that, and so on and so forth. This is, in my opinion, a possibility, and it would be a good question to ask in the future when such projects are being discussed. Now next, Taran Driver, he's with Slac. That was a pretty good presentation. So Taran works in the Slac visualization technology department. What he's doing is he's visualizing electrons moving in a molecule. That's the idea. He's using atosecond technology to do that. And he explained, I think, really very nicely how that works. Now, related to his presentation, there's another presentation that is worth looking at, and that would be by one of his colleagues. She is actually explaining how atosecond technology works, which is really fascinating because it involves making laser pulses very, very fast. So the pulse, the frequency has to be incredibly high. In fact, atosecond frequency just means a certain amount of wave swings per second, which is billions, trillions, something like incredibly fast. He was using analogies like, let's say, in 1 second you would have as many heartbeats as from the beginning of the Big Bang, if one peak to trough was 1 heartbeat, something like that, like really, really extreme. But the fundamental idea of atosecond technology is that we're able to visualize how electrons move. Questions that come up, in my opinion, fundamentally, of course, we're living in relativistic space and we're living in the quantum space. So this combines two of the most extreme spaces. Relativistic space in the sense that the light pulses, they move at almost close to the speed of light, and then also the electrons move almost at the speed of light. But then visualizing the electron, it requires quantum mechanics, for example. So can we actually see something without influencing it? Can we be sure that what we see is where it is, or did we already change its location? So do we have to adjust for that? Those sort of questions weren't really discussed. This was a public lecture of Slac, and Slac is the public lectures are really meant for the public, general public. This is not some academic gibberish. Excuse me for the word gibberish. This is not jargon. Okay, let me say that. Now, I think it's fascinating to see what applied physics can do. I spoke after the presentation with one of the postdocs there, or PhDs he spoke about. I asked him what kind of school do you go to? How do you become? How do you work at Slac? He said that undergrad you do applied physics, and then you do chemical physics, which is really trying to understand from first principles how electrons move within atoms and the molecules, because that's really the basis of chemistry. So if you understand how electrons move, you have a good understanding potentially of chemistry from first principles, which I think is very fascinating, and of course opens up also the opportunity for better material science approaches, which I'm hopefully going to learn a lot more at the at the Nerfs conference, where there's a whole workshop dedicated towards AI and material science. And lastly, I want to talk about Ciamac Moallemi, mechanism design. He works with Tim Rothgarden from A16Z. The mechanism design is really meant to literally design systems for DeFi. So the fundamental question is the following: can we have a system of trading and a system of market making and liquidity provision without a central authority, without a control of a central authority, whether it's a limited order book or whatever it is? We don't want to have Citadel or Goldman or the Fed, for that matter, making markets. We want to have the market making markets. This is the fundamental idea. That's what Ciamac and Tim are working on. I think their ideas are all very interesting, but every time an engineer tackles or an economist tackles market trading problems, it ends up in a disaster, unfortunately. And we always end up with the Fed saving everybody. And now we have 30 trillion in debt and a $9 trillion balance sheet. Because, I mean, not just because of that, but mainly because of that, because there's moral hazard involved and so on and so forth. So this is the fundamental problem I have with these systems. Trading is not engineering. It goes back to Newton. I can understand the heavenly bodies. By no means I don't understand how people trade, right? It is impossible to model trading because you have stochastic, moves, you have jumps, you have irrational behavior and all that kind of stuff, which if you model that in, you can't have any kind of mechanism. So this would be my criticism, but let's put that aside for a second. From a conceptual idea perspective, I think it's just that the fundamental question here is always the same. How can I have a decentralized market making mechanism? Now, Bitcoin has solved that problem by solving the Byzantine generals problem, but what Bitcoin hasn't solved is high frequency trading, trading costs, latency. That hasn't been solved. That's what these people are trying to solve. I think model-based market making, I don't think it's the route to go. I think we have to find something else. And that something else, in my opinion, has to start with the disaster as a starting point. So where do we stand when the bank breaks, when somebody corners the market? We need to start from that perspective and then work our way back towards a sort of normal functioning solution. So my criticism to this and any other scheme would be, you start with, you have this ideal world and you're making assumptions which are unrealistic, and then you have a model which in my opinion is useless because it's never going to be implemented unless you have a central authority like the Fed that bails out everybody. So in other words, in fact, Ciamac even makes a big mistake here, in my opinion, because he says, on the one hand, in his model, the electronic market maker is a price taker, but then he says this is only good for, he thinks that these automated market makers would only be good for illiquid markets. And quite frankly, that's an oxymoron, that's a contradiction. So I think any time an engineer tackles market problems, it ends up in a disaster. Unfortunately, that's a quote that I'm willing to subscribe anytime. And I think the approach should be something along the lines of, okay, how about we start with the known edge cases and we go from there. Now, we can say, look, we can't have a market that has this, the action space allows for, let's say, cornering of the market, right? That's not a market. If that is even possible, then it's not a market. You could say that. You could say that in principle, there's no such thing as a decentralized market. But Bitcoin has proven us wrong. The problem with Bitcoin is cost. So I think thinking along those lines, in my opinion, is a worthwhile endeavor, and therefore I appreciate these endeavors. But I think, again, starting with an idealized world, it reminds me a bit of economics where, rational expectations, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, fine, but it doesn't work like that. So other than, let's say, the efficient market hypothesis, which is a very useful tool as a sort of canonical experiment, but nothing more than that, and then everything else is a derivation from there. Other than that, I think the usefulness of these types of models is questionable. But again, I think mechanism design in DeFi is a very worthwhile idea and worth working on. Thank you.